2020, despite its global troubles, still managed to be a pretty solid year for video games. Sequels, spin-offs, new IPs, lots of remakes, RPGs, roguelikes, shooters, and VR experiences. There was something for pretty much everyone, and most of the best games received the recognition they more or less deserved. But almost every year there's that one very special game that flies under the radar for the vast majority of the community, getting ignored for every website's or publication's Game of the Year shortlist, despite how good it is, and 2020 was no different. Last year's overlooked star was Vanillaware's 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, released in the West back in September. Now some of you might be thinking, wait a second, if this game came out all the way back in September, why even bother reviewing it now? And the answer to that is pretty simple. This game is extremely difficult to market, and it's up to fans to get people to play it, often by being careful about what they say about it. Word of mouth is the lifeline of this game, and I intend to offer my assistance regardless of how shallow my reach is or how late I am. You might be wondering why this game might be so hard to market or discuss in depth, and I will answer that too. But let's take things one step at a time. For those who aren't familiar with them, Vanillaware is a Japanese developer that has specialized in gameplay-driven, side-scrolling action games, often sporting very unique and vibrant art design, usually by company president George Kamitani. The one game of theirs that you're most likely to have heard of before is Dragon's Crown, but they're also responsible for some other niche or cult favorites like Grim Grimoire, Odin Sphere, Muramasa the Demon Blade, and Grand Knight's History. They've established a reputation of creating consistently fun games with striking 2D visuals. As a general philosophy, they focus heavily on art, so much so that most of the employees there are artists as opposed to programmers. And this approach has paid off, because the visual style of their games is often the one attribute that draws the most praise from fans and critics. Gameplay is typically kept fairly simple, but with an entertaining loop that's easy to get into and play for hours. For the most part, plot isn't a terribly important aspect of their titles, but that doesn't mean it's non-existent per se. However, this changed with 13 Sentinels. There's a rather large 6.5-year gap between Dragon's Crown and 13 Sentinels, and for good reason. This game is, without question or pause, Vanillaware's most ambitious project to date, and depending on where they go from here, probably for the foreseeable future as well. And it's specifically because of the scope and complexity of the narrative. As you might have guessed, this plot, which is far grander than what they've offered before, is the main reason why the game is so hard to market. Anyone who's seen only the key art or promotional pictures might assume it's just a mecha game, right? How complicated can it be? And the answer is, extremely. Matter of fact, it's pretty commonplace for Japan to make mecha media thematically complex, and 13 Sentinels is no exception. 13 Sentinels is divided into two distinct gameplay sections, labeled Remembrance and Destruction. The former is where all the story happens, and you make progress by selecting which of the 13 main characters to control for the next portion of their respective plot. This is not a choose-your-own-adventure type of game with multiple endings. You have to fully complete every character's story to finish the game, so don't worry about missing anything. When you select a character and continue their narrative, this is where Vanillaware's typical side-scrolling gameplay happens, but it's not where the combat is. Strictly speaking, Remembrance is all plot. It's a visual novel in the form of a 2D side-scroller with slight point-and-click elements that require you to wander around and interact with characters and items or think back on specific terms you've heard before. It also features the usual striking hand-drawn art style that Vanillaware is best known for, with great character sprites and detailed backgrounds that often have other animated, nameless background characters wandering around, talking, and gesturing to add a greater sense of life to the world. Sometimes the player character you're currently controlling even reacts to these small events, in ways as little as simply making a face at them, like a frown or a curious eyebrow raise. Despite how simplistic the visuals of this portion of the game may look, it's a very detailed and dynamic experience that a ton of time and effort clearly went into. Progress is linear in the grand scope of things, but since you decide on which characters to play in what order, you do get to choose on how you unlock more of the plot. Normally, this is the point in the review where I would start to explain what the plot is actually about. But this game is a bit of a special case, so I'm gonna have to postpone that topic for now. We'll get back to it in a bit. Art style isn't the only thing that the game has going for it production-wise. It also features a stellar score from composer Hitoshi Sakimoto, whose career includes original soundtracks not only for every other major title from Vanillaware, but additional big franchises like Final Fantasy and Valkyria Chronicles. 13 Sentinels music has some remarkable high-quality tracks and arrangements, with some of the more grandiose stuff sounding like work you'd hear in a Hollywood film. Boasting powerful crescendos and reverberous percussion. Sakimoto creates very textured sounds incorporating a wide range of instruments to achieve an equally vast amount of moods. For fighting, for ambience, for suspense, or for walking around the busy streets of Japan. The game's score is an audio experience that only bolsters the already jaw-dropping story. As for destruction mode, this is where the combat is, as you probably guessed. It's where you finally hop into those mechs and do battle with invasive kaiju, and it's not the usual 2D side-scrolling that Vanillaware is most recognized for. It's a tactical, isometric battle system that features real-time combat with pause, meaning that fights are active and enemies are constantly moving and attacking, but everything stops while you navigate menus to decide your next move. So it's not technically turn-based. You command each of the 6 Sentinels you personally chose for the battle one at a time, telling them to move, attack, or provide support. And with every attack or skill you choose, you get to manually aim them. There's very few aspects of these battles that are completely automatic, meaning they are very involved and active. Prior to the fight, you get to level up any of the 13 main characters and equip them with different weapons. They're all divided based on the generation of the Sentinel they pilot. Generation 1s specialize in melee, meaning that they're best used up close and personal with an enemy to deal huge damage. Generation 2s are considered all-rounders, capable of close and mid-range engagement and support options, including a sentry gun that fires lasers automatically. Generation 3s are dedicated to long-range bombardment, dealing immense damage to enemies far away, though they do have a couple of close and mid-range options too if necessary. And Generation 4s are flight support, meaning they're allowed to fly around the battlefield to get around quickly instead of being forced to stick to city streets like the others. And they focus mainly on supporting teammates and debilitating foes. Each generation has their own arsenal meant to highlight their strengths, and depending on the information you're given about the battle beforehand, it's up to you to decide who's best for the job and with what tools. 13 Sentinels combat is very investing, and more fast-paced than you may expect. It's also deceptively deep with the sheer number of weapons you can utilize across many viable tactical approaches. Depending on how you play, your methods of decimating the Kaiju horde may be completely different from the next players. You might have focused on using Generation 1 and 2 Sentinels, while someone else may have only picked Generations 3 and 4. Some others might have imposed a greater challenge on themselves by fighting battles with no more than 3 or 4 fighters, as opposed to the maximum of 6 that you're allowed. There's just so many different ways to go, and you probably wouldn't expect so much effort to be put into the combat portion of a game that's so immensely story-heavy. If there's one aspect of destruction mode that has drawn a mixed reaction, it's probably the art style. As you see, it's not the same type of hand-drawn aesthetic that the narrative-driven Remembrance mode has. It's very technological and clean with a very interesting map aesthetic where 3D buildings rise and fall around your cursor. But the thing that causes the most disappointment is the fact that both Sentinels and enemies aren't physically representing themselves on the battlefield. Instead, they're marked by neon symbols and shapes. So despite being a mecha game, you don't actually see the big robots duking it out on screen. You still see those symbols firing missiles, lasers, and railguns, all with neat effects, but the visual presence of the mechs are limited to the short example movies that play in the corner of your screen when you highlight a move. I understand why some people would be let down by this creative choice, but personally, as I played through and eventually beat the game, I've come to not only like it a lot, but in some respects I think it's probably the best choice. Because while it's not obvious at first, it later becomes apparent that fights can be extremely busy. In the more chaotic battles near the end of the game, there's explosions of color, particle effects, and damage text flying all over the screen, almost non-stop for the entire fight. Your entire field of vision is constantly covered by bright neon lights meant to represent literally hundreds of individual enemies, and their reaction to whatever attack you've thrown at them. I've heard that stuttering can occur on a base PS4, but I played on a PlayStation 5, so I didn't experience any slowdowns due to the remarkably hectic visuals, but I was always bracing for it to happen anyway. I think 13 Sentinels ultimately benefits from this more simplistic visual style for its combat. Sure, it's not the ideal situation where you actually get to see those awesome bulky mechs doing everything themselves, but the final product is still a very explosive, vibrant experience that's still aesthetically relevant to the science fiction themes of the game. If I had to make some kind of comparison, I would say Destruction Mode looks and feels as if Finnish game dev Housemarque decided to try their hand at a real-time tactical battle game, but with additional attention given to the depth and variety of team composition. If it were expanded a bit, it could easily be turned into its own game. It's a fairly common complaint from other reviewers that these battles ultimately hold the game back due to not matching the level of quality of the story. But I think that criticism isn't necessarily proof of the combat's mediocrity, as it's really fun, but rather a testament to how incredible its accompanying plot is. Now, with everything else out of the way, we can finally discuss the elephant in the room: why fans can't talk about this game, at least at length, when trying to get others to play. And the simple answer is, 13 Sentinels is ridiculously easy to spoil in short sentences. When you first start it up and start doing each character's prologues, the rising action begins almost immediately, and unexpected plot revelations start to make themselves known within the first couple hours or so, depending on which characters you progress with first, and they don't slow down. Every tiny section of the narrative you uncover is coupled with new, crucial information that bears incredible implications and shifts your expectations for what's to come. Paradoxically, due to the game being very detail-dense, it's also very difficult to spoil because in order to truly understand the importance and severity of these spoilers, you need to know a large amount of context. Regardless, however, it's unquestionable that not knowing them beforehand will make for a better all-around experience. Earlier I said that this game is very complicated for a mecha game, and it's because it's not just a mecha game. 13 Sentinels is an impressively detailed love letter to all things science fiction, merely writing under the banner of mecha, and features a gargantuan amount of popular, crazy sci-fi ideas merged together to create one of the most ambitious sci-fi game stories in recent memory. This is a 30 to 35 hour game, so it's not some massive epic that'll take weeks to get through, but I'd say only about 6 or so of those hours will be spent in Destruction Mode. The rest will go towards Remembrance, where you'll be clearing the fog surrounding the plot one thread at a time, one character at a time. It's 25 hours of concentrated storytelling, character development, and world building. Not a single breath is wasted, nor is there any fat to trim. The game even has an encyclopedia of story events and terms separate from either modes, called Analysis, so you can look things up and cross-reference details on your own. I'm probably inadvertently making it sound like a chore to get through, but that is not my intention. It's one of the most gripping plots I've come across in a long time, and the game put little effort into sinking its claws into me and pulling me in. Now granted, it may take longer to hook you in, but it will almost certainly do it eventually. Beyond that, there may be worries upon hearing about how much of a grand and ambitious tale this is that it might not stick the landing. If it's truly as layered and complex as I've stated, then the conclusion of 13 Sentinels will make or break its overarching plot. And frankly, I think there's nothing to be concerned about on that front. While it is extremely easy to blunder a narrative of this scale, the game sticks the landing amazingly, and ties up every conceivable loose end, though you may need to resort to analysis mode to double check. I know a botched ending when I see it. I used to be a Game of Thrones fan. And I know this whole situation about wanting to avoid spoilers might be frustrating for those who are inflamed with curiosity but don't want to commit to a purchase just yet. But this is the type of experience that is at its best when you go in knowing nothing. It won't completely ruin the story if you do know some of the game's more broad ideas, it's just better if you don't. I can't offer you anything other than my word on it. The last thing I want to do here is to oversell the game and needlessly inflate your expectations to the point where they're impossible for the game to reach. But I sincerely believe that 13 Sentinels is special enough to be considered an essential title to play before committing to a best games of 2020 list. If you've already compiled one without touching this title first, then I think you've made a mistake. This game boasts one of the most astounding, gripping sci-fi worlds I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing in a game. While I can't go into any detail about it, I can say with utmost confidence that it deftly combines numerous genre plot devices and concepts with extraordinary finesse, while also creating a large cast of likable, multi-dimensional characters. Including early conceptual stages, 13 Sentinels took 6 years to make, and it's very obvious that Vanillaware took every day very seriously. They aren't a massive AAA studio that can pump out $100 million games every 2 years, but whatever modest budget they did have, they clearly pinched out every last ounce of value from it. I feel that if a huge studio experienced in dishing out blockbusters did try to make this game, they probably wouldn't deliver as well as Vanillaware, because they'd probably get so lost in scale and visuals that they'd run out of time and ultimately truncate the story by a huge portion. Now thankfully, very little of such sacrifices exist here. It is fairly clear that some characters were intended to get a bit more attention than they do, but they're not completely left in the dust in a manner that would make them feel like a shallow afterthought. 13 Sentinels is the result of a dedicated team wanting to make as full of an experience as possible with the resources available to them. And I think they succeeded with flying colors. As it stands, I believe this is Vanillaware's magnum opus. It's an intricate tapestry of the most engaging ideas and themes the genre of science fiction can offer, woven together for what is possibly the most ambitious single-game story in the whole generation. And it's supported by beautiful artwork, fantastic music, great characters, and fun combat. It's truly a heavy hitter in all respects. And the reason I'm making a review of it several months after launch is so more people can come to notice its existence and play it for themselves, regardless of how short my reach is. This concludes my review of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. It's a magnificent experience and worth going out of your way to grab, especially if you like science fiction. I don't know if Vanillaware will try to follow this game up with something of equal scale and ambition, or return to simpler gameplay-focused titles. But regardless of what they end up doing, I think their talent is no longer in question, and that's assuming if it ever was. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.